All right, guys. So this is our first panel in the afternoon, and I'll hand over the mic to Namnik, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Namik. I'll be the moderator for this panel. I'm part of the strategic business development team over at Consensys, where I focus on MetaMask and Linea. So, without further ado, I think it'd be great to get some introductions of our panelists today.
Good afternoon and happy Friday. My name is Jana. I head strategy at the Rari Foundation. So the Rari Foundation works with the Rari DAO, governing Rarible protocol, which is the decentralized part of Rarible NFT marketplace.
Hi, I'm Angela, and we work with Future Primitive. Future Primitive is a studio that proposed the ERC 6551 standard. It is the standard also known as token bound labs, and it provides like a wallet to any NFT that you already own. I'll be talking more about it in the panel, and yeah, happy to be here.
Hey everyone, I'm Azim. I'm the head of impact at Gitcoin. Gitcoin is a DAO that's been giving or distributing grants to builders in the ecosystem since 2019, giving away close to $60 million to date. My role is leading BD sales and partnerships for the DAO.
Awesome, awesome. So, I think it'd be very interesting for everyone here to understand how exactly are all of you related to public goods, right? So, what's everyone up to, and how do you engage with the public goods ecosystem?
So for us, the Rarible protocol is fully open source and it has ungated access. So if you are a builder NFT in the NFT space, this is a tool that is readily available to you. It is an indexer, it's an order book, it's an SDK. So you can easily go and build your own marketplace with it, or plug it into your data analytics tool in your wallet. We have applications like NFT bots. So whatever you need indexing data or order book data for, you will be able just to easily use the Rarible protocol to do it. So essentially, it's a public good. And we're integrating a bunch of different chains. So we're trying to support as many ecosystems as possible so that we can help NFT use cases thrive. We're feeling like we're just scratching the surface with the whole like PFP movement. There's so much more that can be done with NFTs, and we're here to support that growth.
At Future Primitive, so Future Primitive works as a studio, and ERC 6551 is the standard. Given that all of these standards are completely open source, that works as a public good, and anyone can use the contracts, deploy their own version on their favorite EVM chain, and have their own version of token-bound accounts. So that in itself, like completely, the entire system that we are building is open source and is entirely a public good.
So for Gitcoin, the idea of distributing grants is done through quadratic funding, and the paper for quadratic funding was published by Vitalik, Zoe Hitzig, and Glenn Weil, and the idea was basically for finding the most optimal way to be able to fund public goods, and a lot of what Gitcoin has done to date has been around literally the idea of funding public goods. A lot of our grants rounds are specifically for that. We have a grant round going on right now that you should all go to gitcoin.co and support for your favorite public goods.
Speaking of your favorite public goods, I'd love to learn a bit more about what are some of the most famous examples of public goods, right? What are some protocols, either in obviously Web3, but actually in life, that you guys think are particularly interesting? We can start with Azim.
Libraries. I'm a big fan of libraries and clean air, which I think has been harder to come by here than some other places. But just like for some regular real world examples, it's non-excludable and non-rivalrous, right? And so the idea of being able to have things that everyone can enjoy in that way. So I think of clean air, libraries, roads, tunnels, bridges.
Any interesting Web3 public goods that you're a particularly large fan of?
I try not to pick favorites here, so I actually will not be giving an example.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
For me, it's the communities and the dev tooling. Like dev tooling, I've always been a big fan of good, clean SDKs, even libraries, and I meant developer libraries, and just that. So, for example, WagMe is an example, and other open source dev tools and communities. So I feel like curating a community is one of the most important tasks we can do in our ecosystem, because crypto is entirely on the internet. We are sitting with our laptops all day, and having a community that we can belong to and someone who's sitting and curating a community, that in itself works as a public good. And I feel like it's very important in this space. And that also happens to be my favorite kind of public good.
Awesome. I'll also try to be neutral and not pick one project. We have a lot of great partners that we work with. But just piggybacking on that point of community, I think, especially in DAOs, like every single delegate like kind of works for free, like unless they have, come up with some sort of arrangement with their DAO or the foundation. So like it's 100% true. Like community is such a great public good, and there's so much contribution that they do into the ecosystem that really goes uncompensated, at least in the short run, right? So that's amazing. And in the public space, it's kind of not the case absolutely everywhere, but education should be public good, and it should be a good one.
So I'm going to throw a question, an open question to the panel. Are there any examples that you can think of very well-funded public goods in the Web3 ecosystem? And what would those be? You can unfortunately say none, and that's something that we should work on.
Well, like the voting platform that we use at the Rari DAO Rari Foundation is called Tally. Right? It's fully on-chain voting, completely free to use. Anybody can go plug in, right? Like that's a great public good. They're a private company. They're not a public company, but whatever they're doing is just readily available and actually powers like a ton of the DAO ecosystem.
Well, unfortunately, the examples that are coming to my mind are all VC backed. So I feel like WagMe, VC backed. Gitcoin is also backed. Future Primitive as well. So I feel like this is something that we need to improve upon in the space, that we need to have more open ways of funding public goods. And I guess that is why we are here. That is why we are having this discussion.
Yeah, I would also say I don't think there are many, because even a big part of my role since I got to Gitcoin is raising funds for the grants rounds that we then distribute to those working on public goods. And it's a very difficult thing to do, especially in the middle of the bear market. And I've been exploring more sustainable ways that we would be able to figure that out. Much of it really comes down to voluntary taxes, similar to like tithing in the Catholic Church, where centralized exchanges would be able to round up a cell and give a small percentage, or dexes and wallets would be able to give a small percentage of a swap, potentially percentages of sequencer fees being donated. So they're all things that I've been exploring to make it easier to be able to fund public goods. But I would say just because of the work that I end up having to do, it definitely isn't a very well-funded place.
Yeah, I think all of these answers point to one thing in common, right? Like, what's the role of venture capital in public goods, funding these kinds of ecosystems and architectures? Obviously, very early in the ecosystem's maturity, so very much trying to figure those answers out, but very interesting. When we think about the impact of public good programs, what are some of the best ways we could measure these?
So we put out an impact report earlier this year, and we've honestly been having a lot of conversations around how exactly do you even define impact. I think that it's a contentious issue where there's not one unified answer. One of the ways we did do it, though, was taking a look at many of the most successful projects in the Ethereum ecosystem were at one point grantees of the Gitcoin ecosystem. And so we decided to put together a good handful of them to see who had raised venture capital after they were Gitcoin grantees and adding up the private valuations there. And then also looking at projects that had then released tokens afterwards and looking at market highs. And for the money that we had distributed versus the value that had been created, it was a little over $28 billion when we had added it all up. And we didn't exhaustively do this either. And there were a lot of things where we didn't have access to what the private valuation of a company who had raised was. So that's been one of the ways we've been looking at it. But for me, there's also been this less tangible one, which is every single conference that I've gone to since I joined Gitcoin has at least one person who expresses a level of gratitude to me that's insane about how either they found their start in Web3 by the Gitcoin Bounties platform, or they've been funded by Gitcoin grants, or their friend has been funded by Gitcoin grants, or they work at a company that was a grantee. And so it's not something that's as measurable, but it's definitely something that I've seen just across the board every single time people hear where I work.
Yeah, for us, we are able to track certain metrics for the protocol. So we can look at the number of API calls, we can look at the number of wallets that are connected, and the number of accounts. So we can like look at these as proxies for the impact that the protocol is having. And then when we integrate with new environments and new chains, we can see what's the state of NFTs before the integration and after the integration. And unless there are some other integrations happening at the same time, we can try to attribute that to the impact of our protocol. So we're like actually looking at the metrics to see how we're moving the needle.
Yeah, it's actually it's a problem yet to be solved. Similar to how we can fund them, we don't really know once the funding is done how to close that loop and how to get the feedback in. At Future Primitive, we have been on the other side, so where we have applied for grants, and the best we can do that's in our power is maybe share benchmarks, critical milestones, but I feel like that is the best that is available in this space. There is no one really going after you to know what the progress has been. Have you actually done what you were supposed to be doing in terms of the work that you proposed? But yeah, I guess like this is also something that needs to be figured. I do not know if we need a platform for it, or if we need to set up communities for it, or a DAO, or whatever, or if we really do need it or not, if it's like supposed to always be a one-way thing, funding public goods. But I guess like collectively we are in this experimentation phase where we'll figure it out eventually what's supposed to be done. But I do not really know what the actual right answer to this should be.
Yeah, and I also like just to build on that, I also think like it comes down to like what is that public good trying to achieve, right? That's how you will measure the impact, right? Like what our protocol is trying to achieve will be different from like, the impact libraries will have. So I think it just depends project to project, and really critically thinking about, I either want to fund a public good or I want to launch a public good. Like, what is it that you're trying to achieve, and what do you hope will be the outcome? And then from there, you go and measure the impact.
Yeah, well, you can do that with developer libraries, and like you said, you cannot do that with communities. How am I going to measure someone, like you said, someone coming up to me and thanking me for the work that I did? I can't really measure that, and you can't really approve or disapprove it. Like you would want to fund them again, but how will you give that as a proof that I once had an interaction at a conference? But for developer tooling, you can maybe look at the star marks on the GitHub repository. But I don't know, there are just so many things. Like clean air, you cannot measure the effect it's having apart from seeing how many people end up in the hospital or not. So it's a gray area. I feel like we need to figure things out there.
One of the things that we did recently, and it's less just public goods, but Gitcoin independently found 2 co-authors for a State of Web3 grants report that anyone can download and take a look at. And they studied 13 separate organizations and had a lot of conversations with people at those orgs. And for the 13 orgs they talked to, there had been over $1.2 billion that had been distributed. And what they ended up finding was that basically no one had been doing good reporting. No one had done follow-up with anyone. No one even knew if the projects they had funded were still alive. There was no support past the actual initial funding, despite the fact that many of the grantees had been talking about how, despite other than funding, there was a lot of things that they needed help with. And so at least the research that we've been able to do to start digging into this is that it's mostly a black hole where a lot of people get access to grants because they have insider relationships, and then how that actually ends up working out is that people are given money and then there's essentially no follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that one of the benefits of our industry and operating on the blockchain is that there's a higher level of accountability for like actions that are on chain, right? But once we leave the chain, it becomes a bit more complicated. You run into the Oracle problem. Hey, how do we know that this money is being used the way it's meant to be used? How do we know that these communities are cultivating the ecosystems they're meant to be cultivating? Personally, I've always been very excited and interested in like facilitating open source infrastructure as a public good, right? I know that Verax as an identity solution is something that Consensys has contributed to. It's something I'm personally very excited about. The same goes to stuff like just even contributing to the merge. To a certain extent, these are the sorts of public goods, in my opinion, that are not spoken enough about. And I think it's an interesting way to shift the conversation to how do we facilitate the infrastructure that all of this runs on in a way that is trustless and fair, right? And from there, you hope that you can enable like equal access to opportunity, which in a lot of ways to me is the ultimate public good. But again, does not solve the clean air problem, and that's a ways out.
Yeah, I think like one way that we're trying to like keep that on-chain accountability, even if we take things off-chain, is we have a small but like highly engaged community, and inviting them in on making those decisions in a way that is transparent. So like right now, we're actually setting up our grants committee, which is 50% of seats community based and 50% of seats foundation based, right? So like we're in a situation we can't work without each other, right? Foundation's role is like we make sure that things are compliant, right? Like there's laws and KYCs and things like that, right? And then we maybe like remind the community like about the objectives that we have set out together that we're working towards. But the community sees then keep a check on us not doing insider trading, right? Not giving out grants to like people we know and that like that have the interconnections, and that we are representing the wider wishes of the community. So like trying to experiment and figure out like ways of balancing things out, because you can't necessarily every single grant have reviewed by the whole wider community and distributed on chain. That's just like a level of work that is way too burdensome. So what are some ways that are more streamlined, but the community and the token holders, if that's the kind of community that you have, still have a big say?
Yeah, I feel like this is where reputation on chain becomes so fascinating, and it might be the next big step in democratizing a lot of the work being done around public goods. Right now, you'll have some stakeholders making a decision on whether or not this person is reputable. I think there is a future where people will have their on-chain identities. You can verify what they have done, or they're not even verify what they have done, but verify their trustworthiness using some sort of ZKP, right? And then you can say, as agreed on by the community, after these certain thresholds, we will start allowing these kinds of grantees, like proof of participation in an ecosystem could be one example. Yeah, do you guys have any questions or points on this regard?
I mean, I agree to everything. I feel like an ideal space in my head, it would have like multiples of many different kinds of mechanisms, so that someone who has reputation on chain can opt into a grant mechanism that is considering that, and someone who's new to blockchain can opt into a mechanism that is more open and free. So I feel like we don't need one perfect platform. We need multiple platforms that have different mechanisms, and I feel like we are getting there with the platforms that exist right now. Like back then we just had Gitcoin before, but it's good that Gitcoin happened, and now we can keep that as an example and have like different platforms out there. And with like I would want to see more mechanisms that have different criteria to fund people. So yeah, that is what like an ideal space in my head would look like, where we are experimenting ruthlessly in this space and seeing what works and what doesn't. And even if things do not work out, we would know how to improve upon them. So I would look at it with the lens of experimentation than with an approach to perfection, to see what sticks.
Yeah, before we move on, if you don't mind, Azim, would love to hear a little bit about Gitcoin Passport. I think there might be a lot of stakeholders in the audience that don't know about all the awesome work that's being done.
Yeah, so Gitcoin Passport is one of the protocols that Gitcoin has close to 1 million users at this point. We're actually working with Linea using Verax for some on-chain reputation stuff later this month. Don't know if that's announced yet. But essentially, it's a Web 2.5 solution for proof of humanity. And originally it was created because the way our Gitcoin grants rounds work are that if you get more contributions from individual donors, you get more access to money from the matching pool, which is what matching partners put together. Those are much larger sizes of capital. And so there have been times where we've had every $1 donated is matched with $120 from a matching pool. And so you can imagine that there's an incentive to be able to try to game that. And instead of have $100 donation, you'll make $101 donations to your own grant. And it's a way of just basically doing fraud. And so we created this solution. It's a Web 2.5 where you sign in with your Ethereum wallet, and then there are Web 2 and Web 3 native things that you use, whether it's your Discord API, Gmail, Twitter, Facebook, or if you have an ENS, if you hold ETH, if you have GTC in your wallet. And based on that, it gives you a score from 0 to 100. And we end up being able to use that to sort of assess how much of a human is behind the actual wallet in place. And it was interesting because we originally just created this tool to be able to make sure people don't game our grants rounds. And then we started finding that crypto up down to like crypto gambling platforms are interested in using this. I've had conversations with TradFi companies that need to be able to find ways to use ZK ways of doing KYC to make sure someone's not on an OFAC sanctions list, but still be able to work with them without the traditional ways of doing it. And so we've now continuously been finding projects that are looking to launch airdrops soon want to make sure airdrop farming isn't happening, because that's become such a normal part of this space. And so working with Gitcoin Passport on seeing how they can prevent that. So it's been an amazing tool that has had really good adoption in the past year that we've been pushing it. But there are a lot of other platforms that are looking to do similar things. The ZK Pass team, Reclaim Protocol is someone I was talking to the other day. Coinbase just launched an on-chain attestations thing. And sort of speaking to what you were earlier is that I don't see any of that work as competition. This space is so small, and we need to be able to work collaboratively in a way that it's towards furthering the overall objective more so than making sure that any one single thing succeeds.
Yeah, I think as long as the architectures are composable and open source, it isn't competitive. When stakeholders don't do that, it might be a bit problematic. Anyways, moving on. What do you guys think are some good funding mechanisms for public goods in Web3? Gitcoin is one. So, is there anything else that you guys would like to highlight?
Optimism's retro public goods funding is an amazing one. Right now, they have now started the voting period with the badge holders, but they're giving away 30 million OP, which is close to 50 million USD, and they're going to be doing that twice a year. It's absolutely crazy that they're giving away so much money and plan to consistently do that over time. And that super chain hypothesis of the more people use OP, the more sequencer fees are generated. And the more sequencer fees that are generated, the more ability that they have to give back to the ecosystem to continue this flywheel is one that I'm a big fan of.
Yeah, and I think like there's a lot of like these bigger players like Optimism, right? That have like large scale grants programs. So what we've seen, because we did pitch for a grant in the Arbitrum DAO, and we got funded as a standalone project before all these grants programs and frameworks actually kicked in. And now, just like looking back a couple months later, they have like 5 or 6 different grants programs that the community members pitched, and then they run them. And there's just like millions of dollars sitting across these different funds, and each of them like work a little bit differently, right? So I think like there's a lot that is becoming available. It might be just like a little bit hard to navigate what all the options are and which one is the best for you. And it's also time consuming, but I would encourage people to apply to multiple grants at once, right? And just persevere, because it can be a long process sometimes.
Yeah, I would say retroactive funding has been the way we recently got funded at Future Primitive. So definitely that. Quadratic funding works, and we have seen it work. So that happens also to be my favorite one. Other mechanisms like, as mentioned, Arbitrum DAO. I wouldn't say like I have a favorite one of these. I feel like whatever works is good, as long as we have like a lot of different mechanisms to choose from. I'm speaking as a grantee, So as long as me as a grantee has different mechanisms to choose from, and I know my options, and I know how to navigate, like you said, would be good for the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, and I'll do a shameless plug that we do have a little grants program as well. So if anybody is willing to be working in the NFT space, come to the Rari Foundation and apply as well.
You know, I always find it so interesting how words can change sentiment and narrative, right? Optimism calls it RPGF, right? Retroactive public goods funding, but it's decided by the community, right? Arbitrum calls it STIPS, short-term incentive program, but that's also funded by the community, right? So
And give it.
and give it, yeah. And you know, a lot of ways these are all very, very similar, but by just changing a word or two here or there, you're able to get very, very different consumer profiles and target profiles, right? Like the flywheel for Arbitrum, at least, hey, I'm not part of the Arbitrum team, but this is my guess, is by leveraging a STIP-like model, you're trying to say, hey, come and engage with the DeFi ecosystem. And by doing this, you will be able to plug into the larger flywheel that you help contribute to, right? And maybe that's a public good in itself, creating a liquid market. And you know, Optimism is doing the same thing with RPGF as their title. Yeah, I mean I think that's a pretty interesting discussion for another time. We're running out. So the final question I have for our esteemed panelists: how can we get more community involvement and make programs more decentralized?
Well, every project needs to kind of find their own path, right? Like, what is the role of community? What do you need them to do? What do you want them to do? And how do you incentivize them to do it? So, like, on our side, we do active delegate recruitment, right? Like, it's kind of naive to assume that we have token weighted voting, right? So, like, you either are early in the project and you get an airdrop for being like an early contributor, or you have the financial means to acquire the token, which leaves a lot of people out, right? So we actively have programs where the foundation does delegate to people who are willing to put in the work, who are interested in becoming delegates, work with the community. So just we bring more people in, and we do that on a continuous basis. And then we give them the platform and we celebrate them when they like contribute and really like give them the recognition and work really closely with the community so that they feel like, you know, their work does not go unnoticed. So like driving that participation is actually, you know, somebody's job. So I think, you know, expecting that the community will self-form and self-execute, I think it might be true for some like really big projects that are just having a major moment. But the moment like you're away from that public conversation for a minute, like the community will wind down. So having like really strong people who can lead the community as well, I think is important.
I would say education. Like, to be honest, while at Future Primitive, we didn't even realize for the longest time that we were eligible to be funded in an open source way via these protocols. So we've always heard of public goods funding, but I do not think that projects who are working on open source stuff know that they're eligible to, you know, apply to grants, and there are bigger organizations waiting to fund you. So I would say education, like the workshop that happened during the L2 days or in DevConnect just a day before yesterday was a really good example of how we can like decentralize the process and also make people aware of what public goods funding is and how we can get more people involved in it and get more projects involved in it. So I would say education and making mechanisms with the community. So these are the two ways that come to my mind.
My very honest answer is that both of them had great answers already. Mine is that I don't honestly know. Voter apathy is a very real thing. Having context in who's making decisions is a really hard thing to do. I like what VitaDAO did recently, where they just have an open forum for people who can potentially become delegates. Like at Gitcoin, I'm the largest delegated token holder, and that's because many of the whales in the ecosystem have denoted me as so, but there's serious conflicts of interest when I'm able to vote yes on the things that end up benefiting me. And so it's something that we've been trying to explore and better understand. But I haven't honestly come to anything that I feel confident other than what both of them have already said.
Yeah, ultimately, decentralization of networks. You want to make sure you get as many stakeholders involved in that process as possible. And again, I think all roads lead back to like identity as the next big breakthrough we need as an industry to really propel us forward. You get as many people involved as possible, um, and then you have to figure out delegation, right? That's definitely a piece of that puzzle. We need to definitely try and work to move away from like plutocratic DAOs, which still is the case in most. But yeah, without further ado, I think we have to wrap this panel up. It was very nice speaking to the three of you today. And yeah, that's it up from my end. Can we get a round of applause for these guys, by the way?
Thank you.
Any questions? No? All right. Thank you all. Thanks. And thanks again to our panelists and panel host.